All right, welcome everyone to today's panel on 20 years into ISWC, what's next beyond knowledge graphs. I'm Olaf Hartig, I'm the host for today, and we will have fantastic, wonderful panelists, and we have a wonderful moderator also. This panel is a collaboration between the Coast Action on Distributed Knowledge Graphs and the Semantic Web Science Association, SWSA. And it will be, or it is kind of the kickoff of a whole talk series that we wanted to start. So today in this talk series, we will have the panel with 3 out of the 4 presidents of SWSA, who will discuss their opinions about 20 years into ISWC and what's next beyond knowledge graphs. Then we are planning to every other month have a talk in this talk series, for which we want to invite earlier awardees of SWSA awards. So this would be awardees of the 10-year award, as well as of the Distinguished Dissertation Award by SWSA. And we have already lined up the first 2 talks. You see the dates here on the slide. So this will be on the 7th of December. We will have Ora Lasela, who is one of the co-authors of the very first 10-year award paper in SWSA. And then in February, in the 7th of February, I will present the second talk. And then we will have more. You find here on the slide the address for the list of talks that are going to come up. Good. So next, we will introduce, or we have some people who want to introduce the different kind of co-organizers of this talk series. So I will give the word to Tobias, who is the chair of the Coast Action on Distributed Knowledge Graphs.
Okay, thank you, Olaf. So as Olaf said, that's the Coast Action on Distributed Knowledge Graphs is one of the organizing parties of this event. And yeah, what is this Coast Action? Well, a Coast Action is a European research network where different countries are represented, and we got quite a good catchment of European countries. So most of the countries in Europe are represented. What do? We organize workshop, hackathons, short-term scientific missions, and talk series, and these sorts of things that bring people together around the topic of distributed knowledge graphs. So why distributed knowledge graphs? Where we are under the impression that as more and more people start to use knowledge graphs, it's knowledge graphs all over the place. And because they are not in one or a few places, we need new techniques to deal with the fact that data is spread over different systems, and there are different parties involved. So we have, that's how we structure ourselves in the Coast Action itself. So we have working groups for providers of knowledge graphs, for consumers of knowledge graphs, for people who both consume and provide knowledge graphs, and people who look at whole systems of providers, prosumers, consumers. So to have a look at the whole ecosystem of knowledge graphs that are being presented in a decentralized and distributed fashion. So these were the 4 working groups and their leads, Michel Dumontier, Andreas Hart, Antoine Zimmermann, and Olaf Hartig. Myself, I'm the chair of the action. Axel Polleres serves as vice chair. We have also John McRae as grant holder scientific representative, Anastasia Dimou as science communication manager, and Stevan Gostojic as TSM coordinator. We acquired this grant. We got the notification early in 2020, which was a bit interesting because that was when all the lockdown started to happen, and we got networking money for people to travel all over Europe. So that was a bit of a clash of expectations, but we hope to be able to travel in the upcoming years and make engaging events for the community. So that is the cost action. You can get involved in the working groups. Just check out our website how this works, and we hope for exciting collaborations there. Back to Olaf.
Thank you. And actually, now we move on to Axel to tell us a bit about what SWSA is.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks for the honor to be able to represent SWSA here. I'm actually only the treasurer of SWSA, and but since we have all the president or the past president and the current president later on the panel, I have taken the responsibility to say a couple of words about SWSA. So SWSA, the Semantic Web Science Association, is the organization that is responsible for promotion and exchange for scholarly work in semantic web related fields throughout the world. You have the SWSA webpage here, and the main activity of SWSA is, of course, the organization and the supervision of the organization of ISWC, the International Semantic Web Conference. That's where probably most of you have seen or known SWSA from. Apart from that, so apart from deciding on where and who to run the conference, so that's basically where SWSA provides calls for bids, as you see here on the slides. Actually, I'm not sure, maybe Tim wants to say some more things about the future calls for bids later on. And if you are willing, or if one of your organizations is interested in hosting the ISWC conference, then we're always interested in interesting bids for the upcoming conferences. Apart from that, as already mentioned, SWSA also gives out some important awards to the community, which is the 10-year award for the most influential 10-year papers of our community over the past 10 years. Then the Distinguished Dissertation Award, which goes out to some very successful and influential and high impact PhD theses that have been done in the area. And then last but not least, the SWSA Service Award, which goes to renowned individuals who have helped the community and or based on their research achievements in the community. Particularly when we talk about SWSA as the organizer of ISWC, the next upcoming event is the 20th ISWC. So this panel, the idea was also a bit to have this as a pre-event, to have an appetizer for the upcoming conference. And I guess the next slide will be presented about this upcoming ISWC. Back to Olaf.
Thank you. And we have one more slide before we move on to the actual panel, which is about ISWC. So I give the word to Anastasia.
All right, thank you, Olaf. I think that by now ISWC was mentioned already a couple of times. It's the well-known to everyone who attends this panel, International Semantic Web Conference, that we all of us join every year. Unfortunately, it's again virtual this year. Let's hope it's the last time. What I wanted to say here is just to remind you that the early registration ends by 15th of October. So if you haven't been registered yet, make sure that you have your ticket to be to this event. That's a brief advertisement from my side about ISWC. The word back to you, Olaf.
All right, perfect. So now we're ready for the panel. And as I already said, we have fantastic panelists today. Tobias, can you move on one slide? We have 3 of the 4 previous and current presidents of SWSA here with us. We have Jim Handler, we have Natasha Noy, and we have Rudi Studer. They are so well known in the community that I guess it would actually not be necessary to introduce them further, but maybe we have some junior researchers, some who have just started becoming part of the community. So let me also say a few words about each of them before we move to the actual panel. So Jim is a professor of computer, web, and cognitive sciences at RPI, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy in the state of New York. He has authored countless of books and papers and articles in the areas of artificial intelligence, agent-based computing, high-performance processing, and of course, the semantic web. So he can certainly be seen as one of the originators of the semantic web. For instance, he was also one of the main of the co-authors of that influential semantic web article in the American Scientists. He is currently the president of SWSA. Next up, we have Natasha Noy. She is currently a research scientist at Google Research, where she leads a team that builds Google Dataset Search, which is a search engine for all the datasets on the web. Before Natasha joined Google, she was at Stanford, where she has made major contributions in the area of ontology engineering and ontology alignment. Probably many of you in the audience have used the Protege ontology editor, which Natasha was part of the team that has built this editor. And maybe also many of you have read the Ontology Development 101 tutorial that was co-authored by Natasha. She was the president of SWSA from 2011 to 2017. And then last but not least, we have Rudi, who actually was the founding president of SWSA. He was a professor at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, where he had led his research group to really become one of the leading groups in the semantic web area. So that's our panel. Unfortunately, there was a fourth president of SWSA, Ian Horrocks, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. It was really impossible to find a time where we can have all four of them together in one room. So with this, let me also introduce our moderator for the panel today, which is Katja Pesquita. She's an assistant professor in computer science at the University of Lisbon. She has a multidisciplinary background in biology and computer science. Her research is in the areas of semantic web, but also data mining. And she has made contributions in the areas of ontology-based semantic similarity and ontology alignment. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this panel, and I give the floor to Pesquita to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Olaf, for the nice introduction. I would like to thank the Distributed Knowledge Graph Cost Action Management for inviting me to moderate this panel. It is a great honor to be moderating a panel with three people that have greatly inspired me, and I hope I can only stand up to the test. So just to let our audience know, so we had previously given 3 topics to our panelists for them to think about, and these are going to be the 3 main topics for our introduction. And then we will move over to questions that not only cost action members have posted, but also attendees have posted on Slido. And that is how we will run the panel. So without further ado, I would like to talk to you about these 3 main topics, and they are very much the past, the present, and the future of semantic web as seen through the eyes of the Semantic Web Association and ISWC, of course, which has been running for 20 years. And the first topic was that we have had ISWC running for 20 years. And our question was, what do the panelists think is the most significant achievement of the semantic web community? And maybe Natasha can begin. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for organizing this panel. I really look forward to the discussion today. So, to your question, Katja, I think when I think about what is the main achievement of the semantic web community from the technology point of view, I think it actually bringing, no pun intended, semantics and the web together. And if you think of semantics as kind of classic knowledge representation, sort of the need and this is the need part of the need and the scruffy, and then bringing and somehow figuring out how to do essential knowledge representation, reasoning, this kind of classical symbolic AI in the world of the web, where beyond HTTP, really nothing is agreed upon. And anything goes, and it's decentralized. There's no kind of really central authority on what you should put where. And so figuring out how to bring these two sides together, how to make semantics decentralized, how to make it useful in the real world, how to make it useful at the grand scale. I think that's really what to me is the main achievement. And if we think about kind of the technologies that came out of the semantic web community that made it or have already made it into the mainstream, into large scale use, these are again the scruffy part of the semantics. It's not necessarily the very fine-tuned reasoning algorithm. It's really where we try to figure out how to get the best of the knowledge representation with the kind of practical decentralized use. And that could be set for knowledge graphs at any scale. That could be set for things like schema.org, where sort of Jim coined the slogan very early on, a little semantics goes a long way. But I think this concept of bringing these two worlds together is, to me, what the achievement is. I'm not sure, I also want to mention another achievement that's not necessarily a technological one. If you walk around the halls of the Semantic Web Conference or look at the organizing committee, it's probably one of the most diverse computer science conferences that I know. And I think that's it's not completely incidental. It's actually kind of, we worked really hard at SWSA on that. And I think that's one of the things I'm very proud of. And I think we should all be proud of that.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I always feel very welcome at ISWC, and diversity is a big part of it. Jim, would you like to add something to Natasha's answer?
Sure. I think Natasha, really hit on a lot of the biggies, but let me put in let me put it in terms of a personal anecdote. So one of the things that really began the Semantic Web Conference was the year before the first ISWC, we had a symposium at Stanford. I think Natasha may have been one of the chairs, which was funded by a DARPA program. DARPA is the US funding agent that funds a lot of the computer research in the US. And we had a program called the DARPA Agent Markup Language, which I was leading, that was funding a lot of the early work. It funded the work that led to what was called DAML plus OIL, which led in turn to the OWL language. So it was a lot of the start of the semantic web, and is what brought me and Tim Berners-Lee and Aura together to write that Scientific American article that's been mentioned. But at that very first meeting of the DAML conference, somebody from a large search company, which will remain nameless, but now hires semantic web people, said, this stuff is never going to show up on a substantial fraction of our search, right? At that point, we were, excited because we had RDF on, I think it was about 10,000 or 100,000 web pages. And they were saying, that's nothing, that doesn't count. This was in about 2000, right? The last published number I saw on use of schema.org, which is one of the real outcomes of the semantic web work, was that it was on something like 50 to 60% of the crawl, of the Google crawl, right? And that was, I think, a 2016 talk by Peter Norvig. So we have so far exceeded anything anyone believed we would be able to do at the beginning. And, to me, that's really been very exciting to watch and see that we really did accomplish getting machine readable metadata out into the real world.
Thank you very much. Rudy, is there anything else that you can add to this vision of the most significant achievement? So we had decentralized semantics by Natasha, and then also this accomplishment of having semantics on the web by Jim. So Rudy, is there anything left out?
Yes, I would start with a meta comment, I would say. So Jim already mentioned that 2001 working symposium in Stanford. And when we showed up there, we had much more participants than we expected. We talked about maybe 100 people show up, then we had 250, something like this. But still we had no community. So we had some people like Natasha, Jim, myself, and a lot of other people that are interested in that topic. But we had a KR community, a knowledge modeling community, a web community, machine learning community, but no semantic web community. So I would say one of the big achievements is that we have been able to build up that community, and that is still alive after 20 years. And I would say it took a lot of effort to get that community running, because at that Stanford meeting, we had evening meetings and decided, well, we would need a conference like ISWC. We would need a journal like Journal of Web Semantics. We would need an organization like SWSA to run all that kind of stuff. But that does not mean that you have a top conference after 5 years, that you have a top journal after 5 years, what we all have now around. So it was the effort of a lot of people to really get that community running and make that community successful. And I'm very happy to see that not only these old guys like Jim and myself are still around in that community, but that the next generation is now running really the community. I think that's a big success to have that continuity. And these middle-aged people, they have now the job to educate the next generation so that semantic web community is still alive in 10 years from now, I would say. I would like to add a second comment. Jim already mentioned that success in industry that nobody believed in. And when you look around in other disciplines, it most often takes around 20 years to go from initial ideas into industry. Take, for example, relational databases as one example. So we had been rather fast, because after 15 years, I would say, we started to get impact in industry, and that's not too bad compared to other communities. So that are my additional comments.
Thank you very much. So this undercurrent of all of you is the building of the semantic web community, which actually takes us very well into our second question, which is, now that the community is built and is strong and going forward with new people coming in, what are the current challenges that we as a community are facing? And maybe Jim can take this one first.
Sure. I think, I've given a number of talks about the technical challenges. So if you sort of search on my slide share, and, you'll see talks called things like knowledge graph interoperability. But that I don't think is what I want to talk about, having been thinking about it for about 5 minutes now as I've been listening to the previous part. One of our real accomplishments was creating this community. And I think one of our challenges is keeping this community together. And it's partly because of a misconception. And I think Rudy really nailed it. One of the things that I'm so excited about, the fact that the Semantic Web Conference and the community is still here after 20-something years, is that it's a very interdisciplinary community. We have people from a lot of different backgrounds. So the diversity is not only human diversity, which, like Natasha, I'm very, very proud of what we've been able to do there, but it's also intellectual diversity. People say, how come you don't interact more with this field or that field or the next field? People from those fields are often there. At the last business meeting at one of the semantic webs in New Zealand, Ian asked the question, how many of you identify with the semantic web community? And about half the hands in the room went up. And then he said, how many of you identify with a different community? And about half the hands went up. And he said 50-50. And I pointed out to him later that he was wrong, because most of the people raised their hands twice. right? It was really, most people consider themselves a semantic web researcher and something else, or they were new people and just didn't get the question. But again, so, and I think our real challenge is keeping an interdisciplinary community going and interdisciplinary in its right. And so, you know, I get people to say, how come so many of the papers are logic, or how come so many of the papers are search, or how come so many of the papers are AI language? And my answer is, it's great that I get asked these different questions, right? If everybody was saying, how come it's all X, I'd be worried. And we've kept it that way. And I think making sure we keep it that way is very important. So I think I'll use that sort of social rather than technical challenge, and leave it at that.
Thank you, Jim. So Rudy, do you think we are facing more of a social challenge, or do we still have technical challenges that are holding us back as a community?
Well, I would say we have both types of challenges. I would like to add what Jim already mentioned, that diversity in our community is rather nice and very strong. I could imagine that we could have more strong ties into social sciences. So we are a more or less technical community, I would say. We have some people having that social background, but in the future, when you think of disseminating all our stuff into the broader community, I think stronger ties with social sciences would be beneficial. Also, when you think that more and more products show up that are based on our technology, still there are a lot of technicalities being required to really use our stuff. And a lot of people will not be able to use these rather technical user interfaces and all these kind of things. So I think that could be one action we could promote more, that we build up tighter connection to the social sciences. So that would be one aspect I have in mind. Second is, when I think of education, we had been rather strong in building up these summer schools. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, there was some interrupt in running these summer schools, because I know a lot of now rather well-known people in the community that started by attending one of these summer schools. So hopefully by next year, we are again able to run these summer schools in person, and not only via these online tools and that kind of stuff. I think that's very important to build up the next generation of semantic web people. And third, I would say we only need more education in the computer science with our topics. So still a lot of computer science students finish their studies but have no clue about semantic web. They learn databases, software engineering, all these standard computer science topics. So I think we would need more people that are at least basically familiar with the semantic web topics. So that would be also one topic I would have in mind, which would be important for all the different types of university educations we are offering. So that are my comments.
Thank you, Rudy. So before asking Natasha to finish on this second topic, I would just like to say that I very much identify myself, and maybe many of the audience does too, with the raising their hand twice, or maybe even 3 times. So before finishing this topic, I just like to ask you, if you were in that room, Jim, Rudy, and Natasha, would you have raised your hand twice?
I raised my hand twice. I did.
Okay, perfect. So far we've seen that. Yes, Rudy, sorry. Originally, I'm a database guy. There where I did my PhD and that kind of stuff. Then I moved gradually into the semantic web community. And I think a lot of people have some different background, but are now mainly working in that semantic web community.
I think that's probably the case for most people here, even the younger generation, probably. So we've seen this need to have maybe or continue to establish a tighter link between the members of the community, but also extending this to our users and our students. So Natasha, apart from these three areas, are we facing any other challenges currently in the Semantic Web community?
I think we are, and I think the way I would characterize the main challenge I want to talk about is kind of straddling the social and technological challenge. So Rudy and Jim talked about our community as a community and the problems we're solving. I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves why we're doing this and sort of why does it matter what we're doing? What are the problems in the outside world, outside of the Semantic Web community? You know, it's nice to come up with the most scalable way to query a triple store or the most fine-tuned model to create a knowledge graph. We need to keep reminding ourselves that kind of who cares if we succeed? And that's what will keep our communities strong. There are lots of application areas that we can think about, and it doesn't mean that we have to go and solve the problem right away. But we do need to think about why are we solving the interesting technical challenges that we're solving. Things like open science. You know, Yolanda Gill often does this talk about when will AI write the next paper? When will open data and semantics have the next scientific discovery would be the challenge that I would pose. Things like understanding misinformation and trust and trustworthiness. There's tons of things semantics can do. And even as we're thinking about the technical aspect of things, I think we need to make sure that we're continuing to think about the actual problems in the real world that our advances could solve. And sometimes, and I think, for example, for the longest time, you know, not to point any fingers, but for example, if you think about attending database conferences, there's a lot of, like, there was a period, I think it actually changed quite a bit, but there was a period where, you know, it was another incremental advance here, another incremental advance here. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen to our community. And occasionally it does, actually. Like, what that incremental technical advance actually changes in the real world or has potential of changing in the real world. And I would like us to kind of always keep reminding ourselves that that's kind of where the Holy Grail is.
I particularly like the in-use track at ISWC because it gives us an opportunity to see that impact out there in the real world in many applications. And I always look forward to that track during the conference.
I think it's not just about the in-use of the technologies that we have developed. I think as we're thinking about the technologies, as we're thinking about the technical problems that we're tackling, if we succeed in making this advance, who will care, right? What will be the impact? Beyond, yes, we have beat this baseline benchmark, or we have improved on this metric. I think that's what will be the in-use paper many years from now that will be building on the technical advance that we're doing now. But it's useful to still think in those terms. And I think it's critical to think in those terms to stay relevant.
But to do that, you need to not just talk to other Semantic Web people, you need to go out there where the problems are.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Okay, so I think that going out there to where the problems are is a good segue for our third and final question. So what comes next for the Semantic Web community, and what will the next 20 years look like? So this is not the final question of the panel, just the final of the first three. Okay, we still have the questions on Slido and from the audience. So Rudy, I would like to ask you if you'd like to go first on charting the future for the Semantic Web community.
Okay, I have a few aspects in mind. One is when I think of the Scientific American article by Jim and others, there was that notion of having agents on the web. But currently, when we look around, we do not really have agents working on the web, composing complex applications by themselves. That was the initial vision. So I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, that we make that vision somehow happening. So up to now, we always have these predetermined kind of applications, systems, but there's no cooperation between these systems on their own, that kind of stuff. That is the basic idea behind that agent-based systems. So I think that's still a vision that is still to come, I would say. I have no time frame for that, but it's still, I would say, in the future. Again, I would say it's very difficult to look 20 years into the future, because when you go back 20 years, it would have been difficult to have an idea what situation we have nowadays around. So I hesitate to make 20 years statements, what will be happening in 2040 when I will most probably not be alive anymore. So I don't know what's going on then, okay? Second aspect I have in mind, we had a lot of discussion in the past about how to handle common sense knowledge and to bring in that common sense knowledge into our systems, but still there's not too much access, I would say. So there's still a lot of room for improvement in handling common sense knowledge, so that we get rid of some brittleness of the application systems we have currently around. So I would see that also as a major topic we should somehow investigate in the future. That would be my first two remarks, okay?
Interestingly, I think that those were two challenges 20 years ago as well. So those, if someone had predicted next 20 years we're going to solve these two, and then 20 years later,
I would say we have been a rather successful community, but not all things we had on our agenda initially are already being solved, you know?
It's good to save something to do in the future. Okay, Natasha, would you like to add something to this future vision?
So when I was kind of thinking about this panel and thinking of questions, the agents was definitely on my list. And yes, you're right, it was there 20 years ago. But I think I'm with Rudy on kind of thinking, 20 years in technologies were in the technology years is enormous. The web may be completely different 20 years from now. But I think the notion of decentralized semantics and probably even more diverse in terms of languages, like different languages, different cultures, different points of view, that we will need to somehow bring together and make the different agents, or whatever the name will be in 20 years from now, or whatever the popular name will be, talk to each other to solve problems, I think will probably be this kind of the different languages and cultures, etc., will probably be an even larger thing in 20 years. It's not going to be as centralized on certain countries or certain languages, and probably will be even more decentralized. So I think we will still be solving the issue of somewhat lightweight decentralized semantics, but probably with a lot more data to underlie it.
I will get back to this topic later on, but let's just finish the future for Semantic Web with the current SWSA president, Jim.
Thanks. So, I was lucky enough 20-something years ago to write a paper that people are still citing because we provided a vision. And we didn't do it by saying what things would look like 20 years from now. We did it by saying, what are some of the key problems to being able to move this technology forward? What are some of the things we needed? That agent vision was part of that, which it still is. And so I would add a couple of things. The knowledge graph technology has been, sort of in some ways a renaming of what we were already doing, in some ways new, but as it grew out, it pulled things back into silos, back into people's own things. You guys are talking distributed knowledge graphs. I think that's crucial. But to really do a distributed knowledge graph, it's not, there's a piece here that I built and a piece here that I built and a piece here that I built. There's a piece here that I built. There's a piece here that Natasha built. There's a piece over there that Rudy built. There's a piece over here that you're building, Kat, and these different knowledge graphs being able to talk to each other, integrate, cetera, especially when we start adding the notion of a personal knowledge graph, which is something I'm very strong on now. In other words, there's information about me that maybe I don't want published out into some kind of generalized shared space, but I would like that to be indirect. So if there's this generic health information, I'd like my personal health information to be able to take advantage of that. So many of the early challenges for the semantic web were those interoperability challenges, and we still have those today, in some ways made worse by the fact that we have 4 or 5 mega companies that are all competing to be the one that owns everything, as opposed to see it as a set of pieces that come together. And I'm obviously simplifying a little when I say that, because all of them everybody gets benefit from everybody doing well. But there's a centralization that's happening and a competition. And the thing that fights against that is decentralization and openness. The second thing I'd say is the use case that motivated a lot of the early semantic web research was sort of this notion that people would want some kind of reasoning, right? I think that's still true. People want some kind of inferencing to happen, but there's 2 things that are very different in the world today than there were 20 years ago. There were a lot of things that are different, but 2 in particular that impact this. One is the use case has moved much more to data, but data not necessarily just meaning the stuff that's in nice structured data sets, but really it's all the video, it's all the so a lot of the modern AI tools are really profiting because they pull data from all that, video from all over the place, text from all over the place, structured data from all over. But they pull them centralized and manipulate them into some kind of knowledge graph. And the question is, how do those knowledge graphs get shared back out? How do those knowledge get shared? So it still needs inferencing, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to move away from the notion that there's some kind of logic, but we now are looking at a much, much bigger scale than we looked at back then. Again, remember that 50 to 60% of the pages out there on the web may have this stuff on it somewhere. How do you even start to talk about that world? And then it's how do we make these things open? How do we make them interoperable? How do we bring that data and metadata world in there? And how do we bring that all together? And I think if we can get our research looking really seriously at those kind of problems in the modern framing, we are actually taking the first step to a thing that will still be here 20 years from now, because I think those will still be challenges at some level in 20 years. But Tim Berners-Lee talks about the need for a massive re-decentralization. I think that is a true statement, and it has a lot of different meanings, a lot of different ways you can look at it, but it's really about openness and sharing and things like that, which has always been what the semantic web is about.
Thank you, Jim. So openness, sharing, decentralization have been big topics in all of your answers to these 3 first questions. But I find that there is this dissonance between this goal of openness and sharing and proprietary knowledge graphs taking over. So one of the questions that we had on Slido from Axel Polaris was, open or closed data, where does the full potential of knowledge graphs lie? So maybe I would like to ask this to Natasha for obvious reasons.
So I don't think it's either or, to be honest. I think the fact that a company wants to develop a knowledge graph and wants to use this technology that came out of this community to build something internally, I don't think it doesn't prevent any of the open data. It doesn't prevent any of the development on the open knowledge graph. I think there is room for both, and I don't see how one blocks the other. And I think there's a lot of cross-pollination in the discussion and in the technology, right? So for example, when we talked about knowledge graphs in the semantic web world, in the semantic web research community, we talked a lot about how we define the different types and relations and how we store the graph and the triples. But one of the things that I don't think we realize, at least I didn't think about as a researcher until we started looking at how knowledge graphs are used in large companies, is one of the main things that knowledge graphs provide is this notion of identifiers, right? And sort of everything can hang on specific identifiers. When we talk about California, you know, every product in the company, when they mention California, they actually refer to the same identifier. And this notion of, for example, how do we reconcile identifiers? I don't think this problem would have come out as a research problem if it wasn't applied inside the company, whether or not it is an open or knowledge, open or closed. So I think as far as the ideas and the research problems and the research questions, there is a lot of cross-pollination. There is a lot of one driving the other. And, you know, I think expecting that, you know, everything that any, you know, company does will be done open is, you know, it's unrealistic. We live in the real world. And I think most of the companies, as far as I can tell, have been pretty open, again, about the research problems that we're addressing, the way we're thinking about it, have been talked very. So if you remember the panel that we're in at the Semantic Web conference a few years ago was the leads of knowledge graphs from several companies. One of the things they said and they have pushed for was something that I think Rudy mentioned, the education aspect, right? So it has to come from both sides. If the companies are asking, we want to hire people who know about semantics, who know about knowledge graphs, that helps all of us because now the education programs, the universities think, oh, we need to actually have this as part of the curriculum. So I think it's quite a virtuous circle rather than a vicious one.
So can I just throw in one quick
yes, go ahead.
Because I don't disagree with Natasha that you need both, but I think what we learned in the data sharing world of Semantic Web was it's not the data necessarily you share, it's the metadata. So you may only be sharing something that says, this is the data I have, here's where it is, here's who to contact to get it, things like that, as opposed to saying, here's my actual data represented in you know, RDF or some other knowledge graph format, right? I think we need to start rethinking, what does the metadata look like for the knowledge graphs? So how do I find out who has one? How can I share it, et cetera? I would hope that's one of the things you guys will be doing in the distributed knowledge graph project. And I hope that will lead to some thinking about how we, you know, essentially develop the next generation of the standards for these kind of sharing.
May I add one aspect? We have all these community efforts put around Wikidata, for example, and I think that's also a very important effort of the community to make these open sources available and working. And I think that's a good supplement to what the companies are doing. I do not see the problem that either you do the open stuff or the closed stuff, but you need both in the end. And I think that's a rather strong action we have around in our community when you think of the Wikidata action.
Okay, so one of the other questions that I think would be nice for Jim is from someone anonymous. I apologize, but it was quite voted. So does the community invest enough in the exchange with other communities? So OKR databases, web, ML, IS, broader AI, that influence semantic web research?
So, you know, I did refer to some of that before, that, you know, kind of keeping an interdisciplinary heart. The problem is, how do you, when you say, do we invest enough, right? We have, you know, I talk at Semantic Web conferences, but I also talk at data conferences, at bio conference, you know, again, all the other things I do. So that's the raising the hand twice stuff. So we have to be our own ambassadors out to those communities. We have to explain it. And sometimes it works very well. You know, the database community was to a large degree ignoring us until a paper on Semantic Web as from a database perspective won the best paper at VLKB one year, at which point, VLDB, at which point, you know, people started paying some attention again. And more people from that community started this stuff seriously. I think one of the things we need to be better at, and I've actually advocated for some of this at the conference, is helping to get people who understand sort of some of the byproducts of our stuff or the ways things are done, but are using it in different ways to come back. So for example, a lot of stuff that's moved to graph database, the original ideas were in our community, got moved to the database community, haven't really moved back in quite the same way. And I think the same thing has happened with some other things I can name. So I think, really it's getting that interaction going. Sparkle is heavily used in the supercomputing community where they don't really use RDF, right? That may not make sense to people who are trying to publish an ISWC paper, but it makes great sense if you just think of Sparkle as a model and a language to that model, not as the RDF embodiment of that model, that kind of thing. So some of those conversations happen in the small, and I think as those conversations grow, that's what keeps us diverse and growing and exciting.
Katja, may I add something to that question? You see, in the past, I was one of these guys always pushing these connections to other communities, inviting people from the database community or from software engineering or requirements engineering. I think it's always worthwhile to invite a person from that community for a keynote or things like that. My experience was what did not really work was we had these pairs of PC chairs, one from our community, one from the database community, with the idea to attract top papers from the database community, but that did not work in the end. So we stopped that idea we had in the first 3 to 4 years for ISWC, for example. But we still would have to invest into presence in these other communities by organizing workshops or offering tutorials there so that people are aware of what's going on in our community. So I think there are two sides of that coin. And I think our community is not too bad to invest into relationships with other communities compared to what other communities are doing.
So I have another question that was quite voted, which is maybe for you, Rudy, for considering your strong ties to the database community. So the question is by Christoph Wessel. I hope I got the name fairly right. And he talks about how to set boundaries for what should be triplified. Triples are not the most compact format to represent data. And for big data apps, dedicated formats are used.
Well, what I would say is you see that the triple format is beneficial for some class of applications and other formats are beneficial for other ones. So I'm rather happy that you see that there's not just one single representation for all that huge amount of data that is around, but they have to somehow tailor your representation to the specific needs of your application. Really, when you have different formats, you always have to deal with these heterogeneity issues, how to reuse data provided from one community in the context of your community by having to transform the representation format, for example. But I think we have to live and also take benefit of having different kind of representations around and always think what is the best representation format we should use for one specific type of application.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think the question shouldn't be, can we use triples for this, or can we use a specific semantic web technology for this? And in fact, when we say, oh, we have this great achievement, we show that you can solve this problem that has been solved in some other way, also with semantic web technologies. It doesn't help anybody. It actually goes back to, are we solving real problems? I think the question that we should be asking is, if we have a problem, we need to solve it. What is the best tool from our toolkit? If it happens to be semantic web technologies, fantastic. If it happens to be triples, great. But it's not, where can we find other applications? Where else can we show that triples can save the world? I would think about it in those terms rather. So whatever the application needs, really. kind of following up on what Ruiz said.
Okay, thank you. So there's this one other question that actually orients itself to a different topic, and it's more to do with end users and lay people and how can we, so I'm going to reformulate the question a little bit to make it fit better with the panel. So how can we have our semantic resources and technologies be more amenable to use by lay people? So what are the challenges here? What do we need to invest on? Or even if it is something that we should invest on, or should we just work, behind the curtains?
So I'd be happy to take a shot at that while the other two are looking scared. No, I actually think that's a very serious question. And what I think it really boils down to is what I'm going to call business models, but I want to put some kind of scare quotes around that and say that what I really mean is usage and knowledge. So for example, when we were talking about getting this stuff on the web, right, what was the real challenge was the people who put things on the web are webmasters, as they used to be called. Now they often get other names in different places, but making it so those people could themselves do it. Now, is that a not this layperson? No, but that's someone who doesn't know semantics. But that's the person who's hosting the page that wants the schema.org markup. So a big part of schema.org, and I give Guha, who was actually one of the originators of RDF, but later said, the RDF has become too complicated. Let's look at something a little simpler. And that's what led to some of the schema.org embeddings. Was aimed at being able to be used by that community of the people who cared the most about usage and search, right? So the question I would have nowadays is, who are the people who care the most about data and data reuse? Who are the people who care the most about knowledge graph and knowledge graph interoperability? Who are the communities we need to be reaching out to, right? I give a shout out to the company Timber.ai, which I admit to being involved in to some degree, but I got involved because what they're trying to do is say, most of the people who maintain databases in the world are SQL people, right? And so how do we take a lot of what we've been doing and make it more SQL friendly, right? So is that a lay user? Not exactly, but that's a user from a different business community, different use community. And it's the same thing. I'm not sure what somebody who's sitting at home, using apps needs to know about this stuff, but someone who's going to try to control their personal data, somebody who's going to be trying to do an organizational structuring around data, that I think is where, we could focus and do more.
May I add one aspect?
Yes, sure.
I think we have a lot of connections to other communities. From my point of view, we could have strong connections to the HCI people that really take care of how to interact with all these complex systems, how to interact with these large volumes of data. Our community is a rather technical one, and how to deal these aspects from a layperson point of view is not so clear from the very beginning. So I think that community could provide valuable input for us.
So Natasha, would you like to give maybe a little bit of your experience with this aspect with your work at Google?
Yes, and I think sort of those of us who were, I think it was 2011 Semantic Technology Conference where Guha talked about schema.org, we were all probably aghast may not be the right word, but what did he, there's no semantics in it. It's so simple. It's so not expressive at all. And I was in that crowd, I'll admit. And so then a few years later, I was on the other side of it when we were trying to build dataset search using schema.org. And Guha was absolutely right. And I came to appreciate this because if you're dealing kind of at the web scale with anybody who can put a web page on the web, everything that can possibly go wrong or be misrepresented will go wrong and will be misrepresented. Everything. And when I talk about data set search, I give tons of examples about that. I'm not going to do this now, but the simplicity of the standard, the simplicity of the vocabulary was actually what made it work, what made it into whatever, half or 60% of the web pages, because we didn't have to argue the semantics, like what did we really mean by this property? And now when we have these discussions, say internally even, we should propose this property for data set markup. And then if we have discussion that's longer than 5 minutes on what that property would mean, we'd drop the discussion. It's not going to work. It's not going to be useful. So I think it is important for some application. Again, and in some cases, maybe richer semantics is helpful, and it's the richer semantics that can kind of help hide this necessity for others to kind of have to express and write ontology and understand ontologies, right? We can actually use our own technology to make things simpler for others. But if we do expect anything to be used on the wide scale by people who, it does need to be very, very simple. Because nobody's going to come to ask us for an explanation,
Which doesn't preclude, though, some of the more complicated stuff being used.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
So one other topic that has been mentioned in the questions, and that I think that fits very well with this topic that Jim brought on about the personal knowledge graph, is, so I'm going to read out the question. So have we as a community put enough effort into privacy and security concerns for building a global web of knowledge? And I find that this is an extremely relevant topic, because on one hand, we want openness and we want to share and we want decentralized, but on the other, we have our personal data there. So what are your thoughts regarding privacy and security in a global web of knowledge? So I don't know who wants to pick this up. Any takers?
So I mentioned personal knowledge graphs before. That's really what it's about. And again, that's why I think the interoperability thing keeps coming up again and again for me. So I have information that I'm either willing to share in some local way, or that I'd like to keep under my control, but still get the knowledge tied to. So supposing I know that I'm at risk for some disease, I may not want to go out into some knowledge graph and say, hey, everybody, I'm at risk for this disease. What do I do? But I would like some way to say, if you're at risk for this disease, what are some of the key factors? And then I'd like sort of in my local thing for it to be able to look at those factors and say, which of those apply to me? So instead of seeing very generic information, I'm seeing much more targeted information, right? So almost the opposite of what we do with advertising today. Advertising today, I throw out information about myself into the soup out there, and something picks what to show me, for better or worse, right? This is where I really want something to be targeted to me that's very specific. And I don't see how we control that privacy, control that kind of personalization. So really personalization is more than privacy, and privacy obviously is a piece of that. So we have big projects here at Rensselaer looking exactly at this issue of personalization of a lot of the semantic web technologies. And notice that previous question about who are the lay people and what they do. Here, again, it's probably not me who's doing that personally, creating that structure locally on my phone that's a knowledge graph, but it's me being able to interact with that locally in a way that reaches out to these very large community resources, some of which may require pay, some of which may be free. I want everything open and free, but I don't always win that battle.
Rudy, Natasha, would you like to comment?
Yeah, may I add one comment on it?
Yes.
One assumption I would have is that your cost action would somehow address these issues, because I think decentralized knowledge graphs provide a good means for dealing with privacy and security issues. I don't know whether that is on your agenda, but I would assume that would be a perfect fit.
So maybe I can reveal that we have been working with health knowledge graphs And so, and that is a very, you know, pristine use case for the need to have something that is both personalized and private at the same time. So let's hope that we can do some nice contributions towards that.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting research problem and technical problem on how to solve this and and I think you can't solve this without semantics, right? Again, I mentioned earlier, we don't want to, can we also solve this with the semantics? That's not the right way to put this, but I think this is actually indeed the problem where the decentralization, the both lightweight and richer semantics could actually help quite a lot.
Okay, so there is this one topic that appears in several questions on Slido and on YouTube, which is, so people are very concerned about knowledge graph quality and assessment and where knowledge graphs can grow next. And we have here questions about, so are there new quality dimensions for knowledge graphs, or knowledge graphs for representing temporal and spatial dimensions? So people are looking towards like, what is a missing piece in what we have right now in the technological layer, and more specifically maybe for some in knowledge graphs. So what should we be trying to augment knowledge graphs with? Any ideas?
So, you know, I hope Rudy and Natasha are smiling the same way I am, because I so remember that same question being asked 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and I suspect we'll still be asking it 5, 10, 15 years ago. But what I do think is important is community effort to those things, thought about those things, putting out shared models of some of those things. And I do think there is one missing piece of all of this that, you know, was going to be in my technical challenges piece if I went the technical direction, which is we desperately need to put in some kind of what in logic we would call procedural attachment. All of these things we're doing now as we reach out to data, as we reach out to applications, you know, the stuff that motivates the move to JSON LD rather than RDF LD, are all about making this stuff active by being able to essentially say, when you see this piece of semantics, take this action on my database, on my app, on my you know, mobile device. And I think that's going to be even more important as the so-called Internet of Things, which now everybody wants to give a new name, but is still happening, grows. So I think really, to me, a key challenge is how we start thinking about that, taking what's in the knowledge space and linking it to all these other things in less ad hoc ways than we do together. Or the way it's done now is often people grab that knowledge and pull it into their own local space where they do these things, which means, again, they're not sharing back out. So I think really, you know, how we attach the semantics to a lot of what else is going on in our online lives is a real challenge, and is part of the answer to that question, because then why do I need temporal? Why do I need spatial? Why do I need something else? That lives in those spaces, and that's where communities can come together and really solve problems.
So I want to add another challenge to that. And as we're getting better and better in extracting knowledge graphs and extracting semantics by learning from text, by learning from information on the web, I think we really need to start thinking very seriously, and some teams already do, about trust and trustworthiness of that information. Because sort of in the early days, we built it from specific sources. We knew where the information was coming from. It was a little bit easier. We are really good about learning this from the web, but there's a lot of stuff on the web that we don't necessarily want to be in the knowledge graph that drives some of the applications. So understanding how to separate these things and how to make sure that the data in the knowledge graph is trustworthy, or it represents different points of view, and sort of this notion of different views and different and how they play with each other, I think are really interesting technical challenges.
I would like to add one aspect to the discussion, that is how to bring in more common sense knowledge into that world of knowledge graphs. because currently you find a lot of facts about restaurants, companies, whatever you are interested in. But all these efforts since 30, 40 years to build up a reliable common sense knowledge basis is not really reflected in the current knowledge graphs, I would say. We have these never-ending learning approach, you have atomic, you have concept-based, but there are still preliminary approaches for representing and collecting common sense knowledge compared to the large knowledge graphs Google and these companies have around. So I see still a lot of work in that area that should be added to these more concrete domain-specific knowledge graphs.
Thank you very much, Rudy. So we are coming on to the end of this panel. I would like to thank all three of you for such a fantastic discussion. I do have one final request, in as few words as possible. So I know that there are quite a few PhD students and early career researchers attending. And this vision for the next 20 years very much is going to be what they're going to be working on. And so my request is, could you, share some advice for the next 20 years for these young people starting out in the Semantic Web community?
Well, what I always told PhD students when I hired them was that PhD project is a living project. So in the beginning, you start with some idea, but after 2 years, you might move into some slightly different area influenced by what is going on in the community, your new own ideas. So always focus on what you are really interested in, and then you will have a successful PhD project.
I agree. I tell my PhD students that I absolutely refuse to tell them what to work on. I want them to come to me and tell me what they're going to work on, and then I'll try to figure out how I'm going to get that funded and supported. But I do think that in this area, some of the themes you've heard today, decentralization, open, shared open versus closed models, new levels of logic. So again, if we're using soundness and completeness as our only measure, and we're talking about things the scale of billions and billions and billions of web pages, each with many, many facts, or with these huge databases and things, that's just not really not necessarily the right way to think about it. So I always challenge AI audiences to really think about evaluation, not how you do better on the already solved data set, but now how do you take that and figure out if your thing is really working on some bigger, harder problem. And I say the same thing to the grad students and younger researchers, Semantic Web. But the main thing I want to say is you can see the excitement the three of us who've been working on this since some of you weren't bored yet still have for it. And this is a really exciting area, and don't get pulled into we need this because that works or this because that works. This is really cool stuff. Keep going. You can see we if we can live 20 more years, we'll still be here doing it.
Natasha?
Yes. So to follow up on what Jim was saying and what Rudy was saying, so I think I would say two things in addition to that. Don't focus just on the technology part of what you're doing, but think about the problem that you're solving. And I mentioned this a few times, but I think it will make your work much more inspiring. It would probably inspire you as well. So solve something that you can actually tell someone who is not in this community or your parents or your family about, and they will understand why you're doing what you're doing. And be part of this community. It is actually a wonderful, welcoming, diverse, warm community. I look forward to the time when we can all get together in person, but be part of this community and both contribute to it and benefit from it. It's a great community to continue to grow.
Okay, so my deep thank you to all three of us for making this such an interesting conversation. And there were many other questions that we did not have time to get to, so we could be here for 3 hours and not finish all the topics. So with this in mind, we do have a link to GatherTown for Socializing. That's to BS will share and Olaf will do the closing. Okay, so thank you very much.
And before the closing, thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting us.
Yes, that's it. Thank you personally as well as everybody. Yes.
Really nice idea. Thank you.
Thank you too. Thanks a lot to the panelists for sharing your time and your thoughts with us. It was a really great panel. Thanks also to our fantastic moderator, Katja. That was a really, really great thing. The last thing that reminds for me to say now is to remind you that this was really just the kickoff of a talk series that we are planning. The first talk in this series will be given by Ora Lesila, which is scheduled for December 7. So stay tuned for more information about that. And with this, I give the word to Tobias to let you know where we can gather for socializing now.
Yes, so part of the idea of all this talk series is as well to bring people together and to like connect the people between the conferences. And to this end, we have set up a GADA town space, which you are all invited to come to. Here you see the link. It's go.vivi.kit.edu/GADA-DKG. I hope to see a few of you over there. I hope to see as well many faces in the upcoming events. Back to Olaf for the final remarks.
Nothing more to say. Thanks all. Thanks also for attending. And then we see each other latest in 2 months from now when Ora will give his talk in the talk series. Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a good time. See you next time.